Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. I just got back from Tennessee, where we had a fantastic weekend touring the Shiloh battlefield with me and 30 of my friends. We're going to do more of those local battlefield weekend tours in the near future. But in the meantime, I did just announce to our patrons and members a Western Front tour. I'll be making a dedicated video announcing that when it goes on sale for everyone. Right now, it's just available to patrons and members, but that will be available to everyone else in a few days to a week or so. But in the meantime, last fall we took a look at the channel Agent Flappy, who now has 86,000 subscribers, and he happens to be a fan of the channel as well, so always grateful for that support. But we want to take a look at another one of their videos today. This one is every U.S. president's darkest day explained in 24 minutes. Our last look at Agent Flappy actually got over 100,000 views, so I'm looking forward to this doing quite well as well. But please definitely check out Agent Flappy's channel. The link is in the description, so you can see all of his content if you like what you see. Let's dive into this one.
From watching the White House burn to the ground, to cradling the body of your decapitated son, to having your entire cabinet blown up by a cannon.
John Tyler.
This is every U.S. president's darkest day.
I mean, so if we're talking about just during presidencies, obviously I think just kind of thinking ahead as a parent, any parent's president's darkest day is going to be when he loses a child while he's in the White House. So obviously we're talking about Abraham Lincoln, for example, or Calvin Coolidge, whose sons probably both died as a direct result of them being in the White House. And Franklin Pierce, that was on his way to become president, and there's lots of other, presidents who have lost children, but those two kind of jump out at me.
And some of these are so devastating, they didn't just break the man, they broke an entire country with him. But first, let's go back to George Washington, the man who could do no wrong. Except on November 4th, 1791, when Washington sent General Arthur St. Clair into the Ohio wilderness to confront a Native American coalition. The only problem? It completely backfired. 'Cause Chief Little Turtle obliterated St. Clair's army, killing over 600 soldiers. This was the worst defeat the U.S. Army would ever suffer at Native hands.
Yeah, St. Clair's defeat is often described that way, as the U.S. Army's worst defeat. I mean, we've had a few bad ones here and there, but I guess if we're talking again about worst days for a president versus worst days as a person, again, for George Washington, it's probably got to be the deaths of his two stepchildren, because he had no biological children of his own, but both of his stepchildren died pretty young. His stepdaughter died after having a seizure, which she was prone to having, and then his stepson, Jackie Custis, actually died while on campaign with him in Yorktown.
And Washington hated losing. When he heard the news, he exploded in rage, shouting that the army had been cut to pieces, hacked, butchered, and tomahawked. So St. Clair resigned, and Washington replaced him with General Mad Anthony Wayne. Sir, why does he look so mad? But while Washington was losing armies,
I think the mad was more of a like madness of King George, like crazy mad.
John Adams was losing something worse, his own son. 'Cause on November 30th, 1800, Adams' son Charles died at just 30 years old from alcoholism. And as if that weren't devastating enough, Adams had just learned he lost the presidential election to Thomas Jefferson. So yeah, lost the presidency and buried his kid in the same month.
So they portray this, probably a somewhat fictionalized version of how it all went down in the fantastic HBO series John Adams, where they get a letter while they're in the very early stages of the White House, and Abigail reads a letter and tells him, and he basically kind of blows it off as well, he was dead to me anyway, kind of thing.
But speaking of Jefferson, his darkest day came on June 22nd, 1807, when the British warship HMS Leopard straight up attacked the American frigate USS Chesapeake off the coast of Virginia. 3 sailors were killed, 18 were wounded, and 4 crewmen were kidnapped. Hey, give them back! The entire country wanted war, but Jefferson responded with an embargo that wrecked the American economy instead. Nice work, TJ.
So Jefferson also outlived several children and his wife, who happened to be a half-sister to Sally Hemings, for those who know that story.
But if you thought he had it bad, James Madison watched the British literally burn down his house.
Yep.
Cause on August 24th, 1814, British troops marched into Washington, D.C. and torched the White House, the Capitol, and the Library of Congress. So what did Madison do? He fled the city, becoming the only sitting president ever driven from Washington by a foreign army. Sir, that's just embarrassing. On the other hand, James Monroe's worst day was a little quieter. Cause on March 6, 1820, he reluctantly signed the Missouri Compromise, drawing a line across the country between slave and free states. Thomas Jefferson called it a fire bell in the night that filled him with terror. And spoiler, he was right. Civil war was coming. However, the next political bloodbath came at the ballot box, when John Quincy Adams got crushed in the 1828 election, losing to Andrew Jackson 178 to 83 in the Electoral College.
So John Quincy Adams in the 1824 election had actually come in second when you look at the raw numbers, right? But you have to get a majority of the electoral votes, not just a plurality, not just more than anybody else. And so since nobody had a majority, it went to the House of Representatives, who picked John Quincy Adams.
After what was the nastiest campaign in American history. And Quincy Adams was so bitter that he refused to attend Jackson's inauguration.
Kind of something he had in common with his father, who also did not attend the inauguration of the guy who defeated him.
That kid who takes his ball and goes home. Sir, come on, don't be a sore loser. Meanwhile, Andrew Jackson got censored by the Senate on March 28, 1834. The first and only time that's ever happened to a sitting president. This was Congress basically saying, we strongly disapprove of what you did.
So censure is something that, it's not censor, it's censure. So it's Censure. And it's just basically a condemnation that doesn't really do anything. It's just like a strongly worded letter is what it is.
Referring to Jackson's war on the National Bank, where he tried to destroy it by removing federal funds.
What we do now is, instead of censuring, they just go right to impeachment, even though it doesn't really matter because they don't have the vote. So this is going to probably happen again if the Democrats win the election, the House this fall. They're going to almost certainly impeach Donald Trump, and they won't have the votes in the Senate, and it'll just be another impeachment that goes nowhere.
Here's a funny twist. 3 years later, Jackson's allies retook the Senate and expunged the censor from his record. Literally. They drew thick black lines around it in the official journal, as if history could just be crossed out. That right there is loyalty. Where was that for our boy Martin Van Buren, who walked into the White House and got slammed by the Panic of 1837? And on May 10th, New York's banks ran out of gold and silver and just stopped paying people. The Depression lasted 5 years. Oh, and Van Buren's political career? Dead. Deader than that squirrel right there. Hey, get back here! Oh, and they called him Martin Van Ruin on his way out the door.
Lovely.
Yikes! But at least he survived his presidency, because William Henry Harrison only made it 31 days into the job.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to argue that the presidents who have died in office, that the day they died wasn't their worst day as president, right? So we're talking about William Henry Harrison, Zachary Taylor, Abraham Lincoln, James Garfield, William McKinley, Warren G. Harding, Franklin Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy. I guess that's all of them.
On April 4th, 1841, Harrison died of typhoid fever after drinking contaminated White House drinking water.
So we've talked about this a lot. The idea that during that 1840s, 1850s, 1860s period, there was an especially bad time for people in Washington, and it probably centers around the drinking water, which, the area around Washington's a swamp and really bad for conditions until you come up with a system for cleaning that stuff. And so you have these two presidents that die in office. You have other people in the Senate and in the cabinet who die. You have James Polk, who survives his term in office but then dies as soon as he gets home from being president. Willie Lincoln dies in that kind of stretch of time.
And his successor, John Tyler, well, he nearly died too.
Yeah.
Because on February 28, 1844, a massive cannon called the Peacemaker exploded aboard the USS Princeton during a cruise on the Potomac. Sir, get down! Believe it or not, it killed the Secretary of State, the Secretary of the Navy, and 4 others.
Including, I think, Tyler's father-in-law. Was it David Gardner?
Tyler's future father-in-law. But luckily, below deck, Tyler narrowly survived. More senior U.S. officials died in that one explosion than in any other single event in American history.
A similar explosion killed a king of Scotland a few hundred years before that.
But other than death, my biggest fear is public humiliation. And on January 3rd, 1848, James Polk got exactly that. Publicly embarrassed by the House of Representatives. Because they passed an amendment accusing him of starting the Mexican-American War unnecessarily and unconstitutionally.
But this was a pretty widely held view. I mean, even guys who fought in it, like Ulysses S. Grant, spoke very negatively of the war, considered it an extremely unjust use of military power by a strong nation against a weak one, a relatively weak one. So the Whigs, in Congress were very strong in their opinions on that.
Oh, and one of his loudest critics was a freshman congressman named Abraham Lincoln. Yep, not a great feeling when a future legend is calling you out. But it could always be worse. Like for Zachary Taylor, who ate some raw cherries and iced milk on the 4th of July, got violently sick, and died 5 days later on July 9th, 1850. After 16 months in office, he was taken out by fruit and dairy contaminated by DC water.
There has been speculation since his death that he was poisoned, and so they actually exhumed him a while back down in Louisville, Kentucky. And you can find the images of his bones if you care to look for such things, but no evidence he was poisoned.
Hey, honey, these cherries are bad. We got any apple pie?
Nice, apple pie. Always a good choice.
Then came Millard Fillmore, who signed the Fugitive Slave Act on September 18th, 1850, forcing citizens in free states to help capture and return escaped slaves, even if it violated their conscience. Now, even though Fillmore personally opposed slavery, the move destroyed his career, enraged the North, and helped shatter the Whig Party for good.
Now, you can argue that it was a very constitutional bill based on what was in the Constitution, because the Constitution basically already included a fugitive slave provision. But it does make it very difficult for the southern states to argue states' rights when they wanted to deny the rights of northern states when it came to fugitive slaves. They wanted northern states to have to enforce southern states' laws.
But honestly, that's nothing compared to Franklin Pierce, who may have the darkest story of them all. Because Pierce and his wife Jane had 3 boys. Their first son, Franklin Jr., died just days after birth. Their second son, Frank Robert, died at 4 years old from typhus. And oh boy, the grief was overwhelming. Especially for Jane, who urged Pierce to resign from the Senate and return home with her and their son Benjamin. And he did just that. But after slowly rebuilding his career, Franklin Pierce was elected President of the United States. It should have been the happiest moment of his life. But instead, it was his darkest chapter. 'Cause just weeks before inauguration, the Pierce family was traveling by train when their car derailed and rolled down an embankment. Pierce and Jane survived the crash, but their 11-year-old son Benjamin was crushed in the wreckage. Pierce lifted his son's body and realized the boy had been nearly decapitated. He tried to shield Jane from the scene, but it was too late. She saw everything. From then on, Jane believed God had taken their last child as punishment for Pierce's political ambition. And Pierce entered the presidency a broken man, refusing to swear his oath on a Bible. Man, I'm so sorry, sir. But after Pierce...
Yeah, I mean, I can't even begin to imagine what that was like for them, and it makes it very understandable that he turned to the bottle, and how much his presidency would have been different had that not happened, I don't know. You have to think it would have been different, though. And he came in at a time when things were ugly and we needed extraordinary leaders in office to avoid the catastrophe that was coming, and we didn't have extraordinary leaders in office, himself included.
As life fell apart, James Buchanan watched the country fall apart. 'Cause on December 20th, 1860, South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union. And Buchanan's response? He said secession was illegal, but also he couldn't do anything about it. In other words, James Buchanan is basically the worst president of all time. On the flip side, Abraham Lincoln's one of the best. But even the best have dark moments. 'Cause on April 12, 1861, Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, and the Civil War had begun. Lincoln had been president for barely 5 weeks, and he'd spent every one of those days trying to hold the Union together through diplomacy.
Yeah, I mean, he was having all kinds of meetings, because remember, before Fort Sumter was fired on, the northern what became Confederate states, North Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, Arkansas, they have not yet seceded. And so he's doing everything he can to hold those states in the Union. He's having meetings with political leaders from those states. He's making assurances to them about his intentions. But he's also holding a hard line on Fort Sumter and saying, you know what, it's federal property, and we're going to reprovision it. We're going to send supplies to this very small garrison under Robert Anderson who's there. And he knew that would probably provoke the South into firing, and that's exactly what happened.
Now, although no one died in the shelling itself, the Civil War would go on to claim over 620,000 American lives.
So a couple things about that. One is the first death that happens there is actually during the surrender ceremony. They fire a cannon to salute the flag as it's being lowered, and there is death involved with that. But more modern estimates are revising that 620,000 number, which is the number that's been traditionally used for most of the last 150 years. They've been looking at the records, and I can totally see how easy this is to really find more deaths that we didn't count. They're usually saying about 750,000 now. Just in my own research, when I was writing the book on Trumbull County Boys, I found several guys who I'm pretty sure died but weren't counted and actually are officially listed as deserters. But it's pretty clear they probably died in a hospital somewhere or died on the way home after being discharged and didn't get counted in that number.
The deadliest war in American history. And then Andrew Johnson became president. And on February 24th, 1868, he made history as the first president ever impeached. The charge? He violated the Tenure of Office Act by trying to fire his own Secretary of War. So the House voted to impeach, 126 to 47.
So, at the risk of sounding like I'm defending Andrew Johnson, which is never my intention, a couple of things with the Tenure of Office Act. Number one, it was passed specifically to goad him into doing what he did, which is to try and violate it so they'd have a reason to impeach him. Remember, Abraham Lincoln gets elected in 1864 on what's called the Union ticket. So they're trying to do a united front across parties, and so he picks a Southern Democrat who was a pro-Union Democrat, who was the war governor of Tennessee. And then, of course, he is assassinated, and so now you got this Southern Democrat running Reconstruction. And the radical Republicans in Congress, who were more radical than Lincoln was, he wasn't a radical, see Johnson as the enemy. And so they know that they're going to kind of goad him into this by firing Lincoln's Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, whom he had inherited. And then, not too long after this, the Tenure of Office Act is actually ruled unconstitutional. So the very thing that they impeached him over wasn't even a constitutional law.
And then it went to the Senate, where everything came down to a single vote. And Johnson survived removal by 1 vote. Phew, close call, sir.
And a lot of people don't know that while all this was going down, Edwin Stanton was not acting as Secretary of War, And Ulysses S. Grant, who was the general-in-chief of the Army, was actually the acting Secretary of War during this time.
Need a cigar? Because I know Ulysses S. Grant did on September 24th, 1869, when financiers cornered the gold market by using connections to Grant's own brother-in-law. They basically bought gold, influenced the government to not sell their reserves, and got rich as prices skyrocketed. Hey, anyone got an extra bar to spare? Life was good until Grant realized he was being manipulated and sold $4 million in government gold. Prices crashed, investors were wiped out, and the economy spiraled out of control. But that headache's nothing compared to Rutherford B. Hayes, who stared down the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, the first major nationwide labor strike in American history.
And this is hardly the last. There's a bunch of these that happened during the next couple of decades, and many presidents have to deal with various strikes, coal miners' unions, the railroad, different organizations. This is that Gilded Age, right? And a lot of times these strikes are shutting down the economy, and they're really hurting the country. And so presidents and governors are dealing with sending in troops to confront these strikes.
Cause after railroad companies cut workers' wages for the third time in a year, workers walked off the job and protested until violence erupted. Cause on July 21st in Pittsburgh, state militia fired on strikers, killing about 20 people. And in response, mobs rioted and destroyed over 100 locomotives. So President Hayes made a controversial decision. He deployed federal troops.
But think about it. What are you going to do? I mean, they're destroying millions of dollars in property. Did they have an argument that they had been wronged? Yes. But does that give you the right to destroy millions of dollars worth of property that hurts the economy in a lot of other ways? No. And so what do you do if you're the president? It's a tough call.
First time they've ever been used against American workers. And yeah, it worked. But at the cost of looking like he sided with corporations over workers. Not the best look, sir. But if you thought things couldn't get darker, you haven't met James Garfield.
So they're showing Garfield writing Latin with one hand and Greek with the other at the same time, which it was often said he could do. He was ambidextrous. He could read and write those languages. I'm not entirely sure there's any real evidence he could write both at the same time.
Who was shot walking through a train station by a deranged office seeker. Except he didn't die.
No.
For 80 agonizing days, Garfield lingered in pain as doctors probed his wounds with unsterilized instruments, causing massive infections. His body weight dropped from 210 to 130 pounds. And finally, on September 19th, 1881, the suffering ended. 200 days as president, 80 of them dying. But while Garfield suffered, Chester Arthur made the Chinese suffer when he signed the Chinese Exclusion Act on May 6, 1882.
So this is a time when there's a lot of anti-Chinese immigration sentiment across the country. And while I almost said Garther and then Arfield, while Arthur is rightly criticized for supporting this as we look at it in hindsight, he also negotiated it into a much weaker bill than originally was going to be. So he kind of softened it a little bit at least.
The first major federal law to restrict immigration based on race. And the ban lasted more than 60 years.
Yeah.
But speaking of dark days, these next two presidents were deeply intertwined. Cause in 1888, incumbent Grover Cleveland won the popular vote, but lost the Electoral College to Benjamin Harrison. Then 4 years later, the tables turned. Cause Benjamin Harrison's wife Caroline died of tuberculosis on October 25th, 1892, just 2 weeks before the election. Harrison was so devastated, he stopped campaigning altogether and lost to Cleveland in a rematch. One lost by math, the other by grief.
Yeah, and Benjamin Harrison ends up getting remarried and has children, like very late in his life.
But during Cleveland's second term, he faced the Pullman strike, when railway workers across the country walked off the job after wages were slashed. And when protests turned violent, Cleveland responded with force by sending...
So there again, you see that theme, right? During this Gilded Age of strikes and presidents having to respond. And responding with force, Theodore Roosevelt is going to face coal miner strikes. You're going to actually have a what is called the bonus army, which is a strike that happens by World War I veterans later on in the about a decade or so after the First World War, and they're going to send out the troops to deal with that.
12,000 troops into Chicago as rail cars went up in flames. Even though order was restored, the working class never forgave him. Kinda like how America never forgave Spain for blowing up one of our battleships.
We didn't, though.
Cause on February 15th, 1898, the USS Maine exploded and sank in Havana Harbor, killing 266 American sailors. The press screamed, "Remember the Maine!" and the public demanded war.
This era is known as yellow journalism, and basically the press, I mean, they just ran with it, right? I mean, because they never do that today, right? Run with a story without all the facts or before we know what really happened. The Spanish didn't blow up the Maine. It probably was an internal accident.
But William McKinley resisted. He thought it was too risky to fight the Spanish Navy. Meanwhile, his own Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Teddy Roosevelt, publicly mocked him for having no backbone. So McKinley finally declared war, and we actually ended up beating Spain pretty easily. Mainly thanks to Theodore Roosevelt, who became...
And it's a heck of a thing to believe that William McKinley had no backbone. The guy was a war hero in his own right from his time in the 23rd Ohio.
A war hero, then vice president, and then president. This dude was unstoppable until the panic of 1907. Cause when the economy collapsed, Wall Street pointed the finger at Roosevelt, saying his aggressive trust busting had spooked the markets. And honestly, they might have been right. Cause Teddy swallowed his pride and let JP Morgan's US Steel gobble up a major competitor just to stop the bleeding. The crisis was so bad, it led directly to the creation of the Federal Reserve 6 years later, which was a pretty dark day for all of us. But then came William Howard Taft, who suffered the worst defeat of any sitting president. Cause on November 5th, 1912, he finished third behind Woodrow Wilson and his former bestie, Teddy Roosevelt. The big man won just 8 electoral votes. 8! And he was reportedly seen crying during the campaign. Kinda like when I cried on October 2nd, 1919, when Woodrow Wilson collapsed from a stroke after his tour to promote the League of Nations.
Why did you cry when that happened? I'm just kidding. I would not wish a stroke on anyone, not even Woodrow Wilson.
And it was so bad, it paralyzed the entire left side of his body.
Yep.
But here's the kicker. He didn't leave office. Instead, his wife and doctor hid the severity of the stroke and essentially ran the government in secret.
I was actually just having a conversation with somebody about this the other day, and I was asked my opinion on it. And my opinion on it is that his wife certainly restricted access to the president, but I do think we sometimes maybe overblow the whole she was the female president running the country kind of thing. But
unlike Warren G. Harding, cause during his nationwide Voyage of Understanding tour, Harding dropped dead at the Palace Hotel in San Francisco on August 2nd, 1923. It was from a heart attack likely caused by his looming Teapot Dome scandal. But if scandals broke Hoover, then heartbreak broke Calvin Coolidge. Cause his 16-year-old son, Calvin Jr., got a blister playing tennis on the White House courts. And it got infected. No big deal, right? Well, back then, there were no antibiotics. And the boy died of sepsis on July 7th, 1924. Silent Cal later wrote, "When he went, the power and the glory of the presidency went with him."
Understandable.
Man, I'm not crying, you're crying. And on October 29th, 1929, Herbert Hoover was definitely crying. Cause the stock market lost $14 billion in a single day, and the Great Depression had begun.
And this is much like what I often say about Pierce and Buchanan in the 1850s. This is one of those situations where I think just about anyone who has ever held the office of president would have failed under these circumstances. It was a moment that required extraordinary leadership and an adequate or even a good president is going to come out looking bad in a situation like that.
I imagine Hoover just sat there with a 1,000-yard stare thinking, yeah, everyone's gonna blame me for this, aren't they?
Yep.
But then came Franklin Roosevelt, in a date which will live in infamy. Cause on December 7th, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, killing over 2,400 Americans and destroying 19 ships and 200 aircraft. The Pacific
Funny thing is, most of those ships actually eventually returned to service. They were able to salvage them and repair them and get them back out there. Only a few of them were never able to be used again.
Was crippled in under 2 hours. FDR immediately understood that the attack meant full American entry into World War II. But Harry Truman's darkest day came on November 1st, 1950, when 2 armed Puerto Rican nationalists approached Blair House, where Truman was staying, and opened fire.
So they were gutting the White House because it needed serious repairs. You can look at pictures of the inside, and it's basically just the outside shell, and the whole inside of the White House was just gone. They just rebuilt the whole thing. So he's staying at Blair House, which is kind of right across the street, and I think Capitol Police officer was killed.
Secret Service agents and White House police rushed to stop them. But at the same time this chaos was unfolding at his doorstep, halfway around the world, Chinese forces poured into the Korean War. We got him, sir! We got him! But speaking of botched war moments, Dwight Eisenhower's came on May 1st, 1960, when CIA pilot Francis Gary Powers was shot down over the Soviet Union. The US quickly claimed it was a weather plane. But then Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev dropped a bombshell. Powers was alive and confessed to being CIA. And just like that, Eisenhower was caught in a lie on the world stage and allegedly told an aide, "I would like to resign."
Yeah.
But Ike
He was in his last few months of being president. Had he resigned, wouldn't that have been interesting? Because the only president who's ever resigned is Richard Nixon. And if Ike had resigned, Richard Nixon would have been president.
the only president to get embarrassed by a CIA blunder. Cause John F. Kennedy had been president for less than 3 months when the Bay of Pigs went sideways on April 17, 1961. The CIA had trained 1,400 Cuban exiles to invade Cuba and overthrow Fidel Castro. The only problem? Castro saw the whole thing coming. And when the Exile Brigade landed on the beach, over 100 were killed and 1,100 were captured. Behind closed doors, Kennedy was furious and felt the CIA had misled him about the invasion's chances.
Yeah, so the CIA was doing a lot of nefarious things during all of this time, and this stuff toward Cuba was well under works before Kennedy even became president, but he did sign off on allowing it.
Kinda like how Lyndon B. Johnson was broken by the Tet Offensive on January 31st, 1968. A series of surprise attacks across South Vietnam from 80,000 North Vietnamese forces. They even breached the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. It was a military shock and a psychological disaster, shattering every claim that the war was being won. And as a result, LBJ announced he wouldn't run for re-election.
Yep.
Kinda like Richard Nixon. Cause on August 8th, 1974, Nixon went on national television and resigned. The first and only president to quit the job.
Yeah, it's kind of a bad day when you have to acknowledge that you're leaving the position altogether.
He didn't leave by choice. The smoking gun tape proved he'd ordered the CIA to obstruct the Watergate investigation.
Yeah, this is the thing that people don't, I think, often remember about all this, is that it wasn't the break-in at Watergate itself that Nixon was guilty of. It was that he was guilty of covering it up, and it really was not anything to risk his entire presidency over to cover up in the first place. And his vice president had already resigned over some tax things, Spiro Agnew. It was a dark time, and you're coming out of the end of the Vietnam War and all of this stuff. I mean, just brilliant guy, though. Richard Nixon, brilliant politician, his own worst enemy.
And his own party told him he'd be removed if he didn't leave voluntarily.
Yeah, he would have been impeached.
So, facing certain impeachment and conviction, Nixon walked away, bringing us to Gerald Ford, whose world collapsed during the fall of Saigon. Cause Ford ordered emergency helicopter evacuations as North Vietnam overran the South. these iconic images of people scrambling onto rooftop choppers? Yeah, that was the end of America's longest war, and Ford called it the cruelest month. But 5 years later, Jimmy Carter called April 24th, 1980 the worst day of his life.
Attempt?
Cause Operation Eagle Claw was a daring, highly secret mission to rescue 52 Americans during the Iran hostage crisis. And basically, nothing went as planned. Helicopters malfunctioned, and one collided with a transport plane in the desert, killing 8 service members. It was a total failure, and the hostages still weren't free.
They ended up being freed on the day that Carter left office and Ronald Reagan was sworn in.
But things got even deadlier with Ronald Reagan. Cause on October 23, 1983, a suicide truck bomb carrying 12,000 pounds of TNT hit the Marine barracks in Beirut, killing 241 American service members. And to make matters worse, the Marines were there as peacekeepers. They never saw it coming. And Reagan withdrew U.S. forces from Lebanon within 4 months. Sheesh.
And if you think about the message that sends is that, yes, suicide bombers can work because they succeeded. They got them pulled out.
That one still stings. Kinda like when the LA riots exploded on April 29, 1992, after 4 LAPD officers were acquitted in the Rodney King beating.
riots.
63 people died, over 2,000 were injured, and more than $1 billion in property was destroyed across 6 days of chaos.
Think about that. $1 billion in property damage, over 60 people dead. I mean, this was a big deal at the time.
So George H.W. Bush deployed 4,000 federal troops and federalized the National Guard. It was one of the worst episodes of civil unrest in modern American history.
Yeah.
And it happened on live TV. But speaking of tragic moments, on April 20th, 1999, Bill Clinton was president when 2 students walked into Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado, and killed 12 students and a teacher.
So I should mention here that library they showed was actually the new library that was built, Hope Columbine Library. Most of the deaths at Columbine happened in the library. The only ones who weren't in the library were the 2 that were outside, which was Rachel Scott and Danny Rohrbaugh, and then you had the teacher, Dave Sanders, who was shot in a hallway near the library. Most of the rest were all in the library, and I know a lot about that event, as many of you know. Anyway.
The deadliest school shooting in American history at the time, and it horrified the country, including Bill Clinton, who addressed the nation that evening visibly shaken. Kind of like George Bush in September 11th, 2001, when hijacked planes crashed into the Twin Towers and killed nearly 3,000 people, the deadliest terrorist attack in history. But where was Bush? Well, he was famously reading to second graders in Florida when an aide whispered in his ear, "A second plane hit the second tower. America is under attack, sir."
And that's literally word for word what Andy Card said he told George W. Bush in that moment. I have done videos talking about what I remember from that day. Just one of those moments that Columbine and 9/11 both, those are days that I remember everything about those days and what happened.
Man, it doesn't really get much worse than that. But while some presidents fought foreign armies, others faced domestic, like Barack Obama, who has said multiple times that December 14th, 2012 was the single darkest day of his presidency.
Connecticut.
Because a gunman murdered 20 children and 6 staff members at Sandy Hook Elementary School. It was so heartbreaking, Obama even cried on camera, and later called his failure to pass gun reform the most bitter disappointment of his time in office. But speaking of disappointments,
I don't know how you could respond any other way as a dad. I mean, they were kids. They were just little kids. Horrific. Awful stuff.
Secret Service agent, this one especially hits close to home. January 6th and Donald Trump.
Yeah.
The day a mob stormed the United States Capitol while Congress was certifying the election results. Lawmakers were rushed to safety as chaos tore through the halls of government. And sir, just for our own safety, Can we not do that again, please?
Yeah, let's not.
But speaking of unsafe moments, Joe Biden's darkest day came during the infamous Afghanistan withdrawal. Cause after the Taliban seized control of the country, U.S. forces rushed to evacuate thousands of Americans and allies.
There's a lot of parallels that you see between the fall of Saigon and this event, where you have all these people trying to get on these planes before they take off and leave the country.
But if the airport wasn't chaotic enough, an ISIS-K suicide bomber detonated explosives, killing 13 U.S. service members and 60 Afghan civilians, marking it the deadliest day for American forces in Afghanistan in a decade. Sheesh. I hate seeing our presidents go through tough times. Don't you? I prefer to see them winning. So these are times U.S. presidents humble dictators.
All right, I think that was really well done. He had some great stuff in there, and obviously a lot of work put into that. So definitely check out the channel and the link down in the description, as well as check out our Scotland tour in August. We've got 3 spots left on that tour, and we'll be announcing the Western Front tour for everyone in the next few days to a week. If you're a patron or a member, now's your chance. I have posted the link as well as a code for patrons and members to get $100 off on that tour, and you can see the whole itinerary. It's pretty extensive. I'm excited about it. Thanks for watching.